Section 6 HIPAA Privacy and Security applies to everybody, focusing on protected health information also known as PHI, and the company may use and disclose PHI. Section 6.1 Administrative Policies. The Notice of Privacy Practices form is given to all patients with their registration forms. The front desk staff needs to verify that this form is signed by the patient or their guarantor, and a copy will be provided to patients upon request. This Notice of Privacy Practices form informs patients how the company uses and discloses their PHI. Some typical uses and disclosures of PHI include treatment, payment, healthcare operations, require EDB law, workers' comp, public health and safety, abuse and neglect. The Notice of Privacy Practices form also details the patient's rights. Patients are allowed to receive a copy of their records and request changes if they believe it is inaccurate. Patient requests to amend their records must be made in writing. We then have to respond to their request within 60 days by either correcting their records or providing a written response explaining why we will not amend their records. We can make corrections for obvious clerical errors without receiving a request in writing. If there is a noticeable error such as the wrong year is recorded for a date of injury, we can make those corrections without a written request. We are required to keep an accounting of all disclosures of PHI. Patients have the right to request an accounting of all the times we've disclosed their records, including who they were sent to and why. This does not include routine disclosures for treatment, payment and healthcare options. Due to the recording requirement, it's best to run all record requests through the billing department so they can be documented. Also, if you're ever in doubt about releasing PHI, always ask a supervisor or your billing department before releasing. The company has administrative, technical and physical safeguards in place to protect patient privacy. Some examples of safeguards include shredding documents containing PHI, locking drawers and cabinets containing PHI, placing computers in areas out of sight from patients or using screen protectors if they are located in treatment area. Locking computers not in use. You can lock your computer by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete and choosing the lock option. Turning off computers at night. Encrypting records sent electronically. Note leaving PHI on voicemails. Note discussing PHI in work common areas, and avoid from using patients' full names. Section 6.2 Uses and disclosures of PHI were mentioned in the previous section. The company is required to disclose PHI. Tell the individual who is the subject of the FI or their guarantor if they are a minor or have an attorney representing them. We're required to disclose to the Department of Health and Human Services so it can determine compliance under the HIPAA privacy law. Also need to disclose when required by law. We're permitted to disclose PHI for treatment, payment and healthcare operations. Treatment activities of another provider. Can send the referring doctor patient notes for follow-up visits to see how treatment is progressing. We can disclose PHI to another healthcare provider for that provider's payment activities. An example would be if a physician sends us a workers' comp patient, and then that physician calls us to obtain the workers' comp claim so they can get paid. We are permitted to disclose PHI to friends, family and representatives if the patient has given permission on their registration forms or provides verbal authorization. Legal representatives are to be treated the same as patients with respect to access to PHI and invoking privacy rights. Legal representatives include attorneys, parents of minors, legal guardians and agents appointed with powers of attorney. The company will disclose PHI when necessary to meet regulatory and public health purposes, including when required by law, to report victims of abuse or neglect, health oversight activities, judicial and administrative proceedings, law enforcement purposes and workers' compensation purposes. The company operates under the minimum necessary rule that limits the release of PHI to only release the information being requested. We're not going to release a patient's entire chart if a workers' comp nurse case manager requests an initial evaluation. We will only send the initial evaluation. Section 6.3 Individual rights to PHI were previously discussed. Keep in mind that patients have the right to view their records. Any requests for changes to their medical records need to be in writing. Amendments or refusal to amend patient records need to be completed in a timely manner. Patients can request to have their records sent to a third party. The patient's request should be in writing and indicate the name and address of the third party. For patient third-party requests, We can always send the patient their records, allowing them to send them wherever they want. Section 6.4 HIPAA Breach Notification. A breach of PHI is the unauthorized acquisition, access, use or disclosure of PHI in a manner which compromises the privacy or security of the PHI. The compliance officer should be immediately notified if a breach of PHI is noticed or suspected. Examples of activity that may indicate a data breach include computers running strangely, suspicious login activity, computer viruses, lost or missing equipment, and new unauthorized equipment appears without warning. To prevent data breaches, do not take patient charts home. All patient notes are to be completed in the clinic. Also, be aware of phishing scams by email or phone. If you get an email asking you to click a link for something that you have not requested, do not click the link. Be aware of any suspicious phone calls from people requesting info related to banking or credit card scams. If you get a sales call, tell them we're not interested and to take us off their list. Don't ever give out info related to our credit card terminals used to process payments. All credit card processing and utility info is handled by the HR admin office, and they will inform you in advance if any changes are being made to our services. If ever in doubt about releasing a patient or company info, always check with your supervisor or the compliance officer. Better safe than sorry. If there is a data breach of PHI, inform the compliance officer so an investigation can be completed. Section 6.5 has a glossary of terms you can read over pertaining to HIPAA.